Hello and welcome back to Lecture 12. In this lecture we will continue our discussion of Sophocles by looking at one of his most famous and most often produced plays, Antigone. Antigone is conventionally dated to 442 BC and thus is considered to be the second of Sophocles' extant plays. Most scholars assume that Ajax was written a few years before Antigone. Now, many people read Sophocles' Theban plays in the order of their stories. That is, they start with Oedipus the king, then move on to Oedipus at Colonus, and finally read Antigone as the third of those three plays. This makes sense in terms of the development of the storyline. The chronology within the story of Oedipus's family does go in that order. But for our purposes, since Antigone is the first of the three plays that Sophocles wrote, at least if our dating of it is correct, it makes more sense to look at it first, then at Oedipus the king, and then at Oedipus at Colonus, because Antigone represents Sophocles' first thoughts on the story of Oedipus and his family, and so I think it makes sense to consider it first. It's a notable fact that many Greek tragedies are set in the town of Thebes. Not just Sophocles' three Theban plays, although actually Oedipus at Colonus is not set in Thebes, so it refers to it, but many extant and lost plays by Aeschylus and Euripides as well are set in Thebes. One question that obviously is brought up by this is, why should Thebes be so important in tragedy? What does Thebes represent in tragedy? Froma Zeitlin has suggested that Thebes functions in tragedy as a kind of anti-Athens, as she puts it. That Thebes in tragedy is a city where resolution, either of civic or familial discord, is absolutely impossible. That the kind of resolution represented by Aeschylus's Eumenides cannot take place in Thebes, and that therefore in Thebes, the conflicts and impasses that characterize tragedy are pushed to their limits in Theban stories. This certainly seems to be illustrated by Antigone, because Antigone is a good illustration, almost the best illustration we have in tragedy, of both civic and familial impasses. It's a story in which both the civic order and the family order break down. The action of Antigone takes place after the war described in Aeschylus's Seven Against Thebes. The two sons of Oedipus's incestuous marriage, Eteocles and Polynices, have just killed one another in single combat. Their uncle Creon, who is now king of the city since all of Oedipus's male heirs are dead, has decreed that the body of Eteocles, who was the defender of Thebes, shall be buried with full honor and ceremony, but that the body of Polynices must lie unburied and untouched for dogs and wild birds to tear apart. And Creon has further decreed that anyone who disobeys this edict and buries Polynices will suffer the penalty of death. This is a terrible punishment for Polynices, not just because of the revulsion that I suppose any of us would feel in any culture at the idea of a body being left unburied and untended, but because in Greek thought the idea was very strongly present that when a body was left unburied, the soul of that person could not find its way, could not make its way into Tartarus, into the underworld, the home of dead souls. Now, in Greek mythology, the underworld is scarcely a pleasant place to be. It's a very grim and gray sort of existence. But apparently it was considered even worse to be caught in a kind of everlasting in-between state, neither dead nor alive, remaining in the world as a ghost, unable to find one's way into Tartarus, was considered a very terrible thing indeed. And so when Creon decrees that Polynices must not be buried, he is in effect condemning Polynices' soul to an eternity of irresolution, an eternity of not being able to find its way to Tartarus. Oedipus's daughter Antigone, also the sister of Polynices and Eteocles, resolves to bury her brother despite the penalty that Creon has enacted for such a thing, despite the fact that it will result, that is, in her own death. And the play opens with Antigone asking her sister Ismene to help her bury their brother. Like Chrysothemis in Electra, Ismene sympathizes She too feels terrible about Creon's edict, but she advises Antigone to obey the edict. She reminds Antigone that they are only girls, that Creon is the king and the head of their family, and that they cannot really do anything about the edict as much as they might like to. Like Electra in her title play, Antigone resolves to do what she must do alone. She asks for her sister's help, but if her sister will not help her, Antigone is resolved, as Electra was resolved, to take matters into her own individual hands. The outcome is utterly predictable. Antigone is caught burying her brother's body, brought before Creon, and condemned to die by being sealed up in a cave and left to starve. Now, the plot is complicated by the fact that Antigone is the fiancée of Creon's son Haemon, and Haemon pleads with his father not to kill Antigone, but to be merciful. Creon does eventually relent. By the end of the play, Creon does change his mind, not because of his son Haemon's pleadings, but rather because he is told by the prophet Tiresias that he, Creon, was wrong, and Tiresias gives Creon evidence of this by saying that the gods are clearly angry at what Creon has done. The gods are refusing to accept sacrifices. Burnt offerings will not catch fire on the altars. There are other very ominous omens going around that make it clear to the prophet Tiresias that Creon was wrong and the gods are angry at him. Creon does change his mind, but he changes his mind too late. When he goes to the cave to let Antigone out, he finds that she has hanged herself in the cave. His son Haemon, who has also gone to the cave, commits suicide in front of his father's eyes. This is all reported in a messenger speech. And finally, Creon's wife, Eurydice, when she hears of the death of her son, kills herself as well. So at the end of the play, Creon is left bereft of wife and son. The only remaining member of his extended family is Ismene. The play, however, is much more than this bare sketch would indicate. The conflict between Creon and Antigone is not a matter of one being absolutely right and the other being absolutely wrong. There's a great deal to be said for and against each side. On one level, the conflict between Antigone and Creon emphasizes the conflict that I've mentioned before between the claims of the oikos and the claims of the polis, that recurrent theme in Greek tragedy about how do you balance the claims of family against the claims of community. Just as a side note here, I think this is one reason that Greek tragedy remains compelling today, that so many of these tragedies are still very moving to read, because that is a kind of conflict that doesn't go away. That's something people still have to deal with today. I was reminded of this recently when I saw a production of Arthur Miller's wonderful play, All My Sons, and I realized that one theme of that play is exactly the same thing. How does one balance conflicting claims between family loyalty and community loyalty, or patriotism, if you want to put it that way? In Antigone, in the play Antigone, the character Antigone believes and says clearly that her loyalty to her immediate family, her loyalty to her oikos, must override all other claims. And in saying this, she is following the expected allegiance of a woman. She's acting as a woman should act, but she's pushing it to an extreme, to a dangerous extreme. Creon, on the other hand, believes and very clearly states in the play that the claims of the polis for him must be paramount. His loyalty to, his duty to the community must override all other claims. In so saying and believing, he is following the expected allegiances of a man, but pushing them to a dangerous extreme. So we have the conflict laid out very clearly, and we have both sides of it pushed to an extreme. Antigone undervalues her duty to her polis and to its ruler. Creon undervalues his duty to his oikos, his family. And yet part of the genius that Sophocles shows in constructing this conflict within this play is that the categories of oikos and polis are confused, or it might be better to say are interwoven, interlinked here, because Antigone is not just Creon's niece, he's not just a member of her family, he is also her ruler, and therefore the head of her polis. And Antigone is not just Creon's subject, she's also his niece and his future daughter-in-law. So each of them finds in the other both oikos and polis, and that's part of what makes their conflict so complicated. I find that in modern productions of Antigone, of which I've seen several, Creon is often treated as an out-and-out villain. I've seen some productions that might as well have put him in a long black cape with a handlebar mustache and had him slink around saying, "I'll get you, my pretty." I think this trivializes both the character of Creon and the import of the play. I do not see Creon as an out-and-out villain. He is a character who has a great deal to be said on his side. As king, his primary duty is to protect his city. Polynices, Antigone's brother, had attacked his own city and had caused a civil war. Remember, as I said when we were talking about Aeschylus's 7 against Thebes, Polynices and Eteocles had agreed to share the kingship in alternating years. Eteocles had refused to give the kingship up. Polynices raised an army with 6 other leaders and brought it against his native city of Thebes. Now, Polynices may have had a legitimate gripe against his brother Eteocles, but instigating a civil war against your own community is a terrible, terrible thing to do. Civil war is, of course, the worst kind of war possible because all the victims are from the same community. It devastates a community worse than anything else. And this is what Polynices has brought against his own city, his own polis. Creon's edict that Polynices must not be buried is clearly meant to display the absolutely abhorrent nature of Polynices' actions, and also, I think no less clearly, it's meant to deter others. By giving such a horrific punishment to Polynices, Creon means to make others stop and think before, for any reason whatsoever, they instigate a civil war in their own community. And Creon also demands that everyone should obey his edict because it is the law. He, as king, cannot allow any and every citizen to pick and choose which laws they happen to want to obey. His edict is law, and the citizens therefore must obey it no matter what they think of it. Now, in order to understand Creon's character, I think we have to remember that within the play itself, Creon is the legitimate ruler of Thebes, and his edicts are law. Within the play itself, his right to rule is not questioned. He is the legitimate king, the lawful ruler of his city, and therefore what he decrees is law, and the citizens are bound to obey it. So there's a good deal to be said on Creon's side. Polynices had done a terrible thing. A king or any system of government cannot really allow citizens simply to decide which laws they want to obey, and thus I think the play is trivialized if we make Creon out to be simply the villain. I think the play is also trivialized if we see Antigone as unambiguously and absolutely admirable. To the original audience, Antigone would have been a very uncomfortable and disturbing figure indeed. She is a young, unmarried girl. That means she's probably about 14 or 15 years old, who is directly and intentionally defying the head of her household. She is a citizen who is defying lawful authority. She is a woman who is defying male authority. And all of those aspects of Antigone's character would have made her anything but immediately admirable to a 5th century Greek audience. Now, her reason for this threefold act of defiance is that she thinks Creon did not have the right to make the edict that he made. She thinks that his edict was unjust, and she says quite clearly that she holds herself bound by the gods' laws, not by Creon's laws. When Creon asks her if she knew of the edict telling her she must not bury her brother, she says, "Of course I knew about it. It had been announced publicly." He then asks her, "So you then dared to disobey anyway?" And this is what Antigone says. "Yes, it was not Zeus that made that proclamation, nor did justice, which lives with those below, enact such laws as that for mankind. I did not believe your proclamation had such power to enable one who will someday die to override God's ordinances, unwritten and secure. They are not of today and yesterday. They live forever. None knows when they first were." So she quite clearly states that she finds herself bound by higher laws, by the laws of the gods, rather than by Creon's laws. In effect, what this means is, one thing I like to explore with my students in the classroom, is that one way of reading Antigone can be to see it as the first drama on the topic of civil disobedience, because what we really have here in Antigone is a discussion of what we now call civil disobedience. Creon thinks that the law must be obeyed, whether an individual agrees with it or not. Antigone thinks that her individual understanding of the gods' laws supersedes human laws, and that is the essence of civil disobedience. If you think about the great civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, many of those who opposed that said, the laws may be unjust, but they are the law, so you should obey them. And of course, the great activists of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and the others, said, no, the laws are unjust, and therefore we must break them openly, intentionally, and take the legal penalties for so doing. That's the essence of civil disobedience. That's what Antigone does. She breaks the law, and she has every intention of taking the penalty for breaking the law. Now, both of these stances, both sides of the picture, have a great deal to be said for them in the play Antigone. But both of them are dangerous if pushed to extremes. Creon says you must obey the law whether you like it or not because it is the law. If you push that position to an extreme, obviously the extreme that you get is totalitarianism. On the other hand, and this is something that my students are less immediately able to see. They can see the danger of Creon's position. It's harder to see the danger of Antigone's position. But if every citizen in society says, I will only obey those laws that my individual conscience tells me to obey, the end result is anarchy. Suppose I have an individual conscience that tells me it is perfectly all right for me to steal any money I happen to need, and therefore I choose not to obey the laws against stealing. Or suppose any number of suppositions. If every citizen says, I will only obey the laws I like, or the laws that I agree with, then we have anarchy. And so the balance between these two extremes, between totalitarianism as the extreme of Creon's position, anarchy as the extreme of Antigone's position, the balance between those two is a very difficult one for any society to find, perhaps particularly for democratic societies to find, where we do think that citizens have the right to a great deal of self-determination. And so finding a balance between these two extremes is no less a problem for democracy now, at the beginning of the 21st century, than it was for democratia in the 5th century BC. And I think this has a lot to do with why Antigone is one of the most frequently produced of all ancient Greek tragedies, because it still so obviously and so immediately speaks to concerns that we share today. There's right and wrong on both sides, as I said, but the play does make it quite clear, at least I think the play makes it quite clear, which way the balance falls. Creon realizes that he was wrong, as I mentioned already, when the seer Tiresias tells him that the gods are refusing to accept sacrifices because Creon has confused the world of the living and the dead. What Tiresias means by that is that Creon has done two things, each of which are abhorrent in the gods' eyes. He has left a dead man unburied. That is, he has left someone who belongs to the world of the dead present in the world of the living. And, no less horrible and abhorrent, he has walled up the living Antigone in a cave that is in effect a tomb. So he has put a living person in the world of the dead. He has confused the two worlds, the living and the dead. And what Tiresias brings Creon to see is that his crucial mistake, Creon's crucial mistake, was to forget the limitations of human power. As king, Creon has the right, within the storyline of the play, to pass laws about anything which happens to be under the jurisdiction of a human king. But Creon has forgotten the difference between human authority and divine authority, and has thought that his authority extends to laws that, as Antigone told him, belong to the gods and not to humans. The necessity of burying the dead is one of those things that in Greek thought, as I assume in most cultures, belongs to the realm of the gods. That is something over which Creon did not have authority, over which he did not have jurisdiction. And so his crucial mistake was to forget that. Not to think that as king he had absolute power. He does. But to think that as king he had absolute power over things which no human being can choose to legislate for or against. So Antigone was correct when she told him that his authority did not extend to such matters. And Creon comes to see this. However, he comes to see it, as I already said, too late to rectify his mistake. Antigone, Haemon, and Creon's wife Eurydice all die because of Creon's mistaken judgment. Tiresias is not the only character who tells Creon that he is wrong. The people back Antigone, as does Haemon. We're told that the people back Antigone. But the fact that she is right in her estimation of the relative power of human and divine law does not make Antigone less disturbing a character, I think, either for the original audience or for the chorus within the play. The chorus is quite clearly uncomfortable with Antigone. They quite clearly don't know exactly what to make of her. They remark on her stubbornness and her unyielding nature and tell her that these are the things that have led her to the position she is in now. In fact, Antigone is exactly what Bernard Knox is referring to when he reminds us that Sophoclean heroes are called Deinos within the play, that word that means wonderful, terrible, and strange. Antigone is at one and the same time both admirable and deeply repellent. She is a very uncomfortable figure for other characters in the play to deal with, and we assume for the original audience to contemplate. The fact that Creon is in many ways more understandable, more human than Antigone, underscores the difficulty of discerning the balance between these conflicting areas of duty. Creon is a much, much more likable character. He's a more understandable character, I think, at least for me, and I think for many readers, and almost undoubtedly for the original audience. The scales seem to be weighted at first in Creon's favor. As the male, as the head of the household, as the legitimate ruler, we would almost be led to expect that right would be more on his side than on Antigone's. It's rather a surprising twist of events that Antigone turns out to have more right on her side than Creon does. And I think, as I said, this underscores just how difficult it is to know where the exact balance of one's duty to Oikos and to Pallas, or to any other conflicting pair of duties, should lie. The play demonstrates pretty clearly that the gods' laws are paramount and that human power is limited. Now, this is a topic that would have had immediate relevance to Sophocles' audience. In the 5th century BC, such topics as this, the exact nature of divinity, whether human power is or is not limited, whether we owe anything to the gods, whether we should take the gods into consideration, all of those are topics that were being hotly debated in Athens in the mid-5th century BC, particularly under the influence of and through the teaching of a controversial group of thinkers, teachers, philosophers, whatever you want to call them, called the Sophists. The Sophists are usually described as a group of itinerant teachers who specialized in teaching rhetoric and techniques of argumentation. And that was indeed the main thing they did, and probably the main reason for their appeal in Athens in the 5th century. People who wanted to speak in the assembly would find it very useful to have training in rhetoric so that they could present their case as persuasively as possible. But the Sophists made a great many people very, very uncomfortable for various reasons. First, as teachers of rhetoric, they were accused of making the weaker argument appear stronger or making the worse argument appear better. As far as we can tell, what they did was teach in a way that would no longer strike us as terribly controversial. They taught their students to argue both sides of a case, just as we do in debating teams in high schools today. But at the time, this was seen as disturbing and alarming because it meant that rhetorical skill had suddenly been separated from, divorced from, any adherence to truth. If a pupil is taught to argue both sides of a case equally persuasively, then how do we, the untutored people who have not gone to the Sophists, know if we can trust or believe what someone tells us? If persuasiveness is simply a matter of rhetorical training and skill, how can we ever be sure that we are being persuaded to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing? And this, I think, is what was meant by the charge so frequently leveled against the sophists, that they taught young men to make the worse argument appear better, to make the weaker argument appear stronger. That was one reason people were very uncomfortable with them. Another reason was that they also seemed to have espoused a naturalistic view of morality and religion, and to have questioned the universal validity of morals. The most famous sophist was Protagoras, who lived from around 490 to 420 BC. He was not Athenian, but he spent a lot of time in Athens. Protagoras is best remembered for his dictum, "Man is the measure of all things," by which he seems to mean not, as it's often, I think, misinterpreted, that man is the greatest thing in the universe and all else is to be measured by comparison to him. That's how a lot of people reading it out of context take it. I don't think that's what Protagoras meant at all. I think he meant the individual human reason is the only measuring stick that we, human beings, have to interpret the rest of the world, that our minds are the measure by which we know everything else. And it's very frequently said that Protagoras by this meant, in effect, all beliefs are true for those who believe them. If you believe something to be true, it is, because the only measuring stick you have is your own mind. Very, very modern sounding stuff, isn't it? Sort of surprisingly modern and relativistic. Protagoras is also reported to have taught that moral beliefs are true for the communities in which they are held. Obviously, these are frightening and disturbing things to be said in any century, and Protagoras upset a good many people. The sophists also questioned the validity of oracles, and this implies questioning the existence or the relevance of the gods. If we cannot trust that oracles are valid, how can we know whether the gods take any interest in us, whether the gods are relevant, whether the gods are even there? So the opponents of the sophists accused them of corrupting morals and of weakening religious beliefs, but they were nevertheless extremely popular as teachers of rhetoric. Now, the controversy over sophism is relevant not only to our understanding of Antigone's and Creon's positions, it also, I think, is very important for our understanding of one of the most famous passages in Sophocles' Antigone, a choral ode that is often referred to as the Ode to Man. This choral ode is very frequently excerpted from Antigone, printed in anthologies of great world literature, and when it is so excerpted, taken out of context, it's usually read as Sophocles' great paean to humanism, Sophocles' praise of humanistic values, and so forth. I have long thought that that is a completely and absolutely incorrect reading of what Sophocles is doing with this ode. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read the whole ode, but it begins, these are the first few lines, "Many are the wonders, none is more wonderful than man. This it is that crosses the sea with the south wind storming and the waves swelling, breaking around him in roaring surf. He it is again who wears away the earth, oldest of gods, immortal, unwearied, as the plows wind across her from year to year, when he works her with the breed that comes from horses." And the chorus goes on to talk about the other things that humans can do. Catching animals, hunting, catching fish in nets, taming horses and bulls, and so forth. And they finally end up by saying, only against death has man not found any remedy or any means of contrivance. Now, there are several things to notice here. First of all, the word translated as wonders is none other than our old friend Denos. You could equally well translate those opening lines. There are many terrible things, but none is so terrible as man. There are many strange things, but none is so strange as man. When we translate it, there are many wonders, but none is so wondrous as man. We have imported a kind of optimism, a kind of approval into the lines that really is not there in the Greek. Another point is that many of the skills for which the chorus praises man are themselves ambiguous. For instance, shipbuilding figures in Greek myth over and over again as a kind of proto-transgression, violation of boundaries. Humans are land animals. When they take to the water, they are crossing a boundary that perhaps they should not have crossed. Even agriculture, plowing the earth, is often used in myth as an indication of the miserable state of modern men, as opposed to our ancestors in the Golden Age who did not have to plow. So all of these things that sound positive at first aren't, when you look beneath the surface, or aren't unambiguously positive. The chorus points out that all of human cleverness has not found an escape from death, and that really is the turning point where the ode turns towards the gods. And at the very end of the ode, the chorus says that a man and his city do well when he manages to weave together the laws of the land and the justice of the gods, thus pointing directly to the entire conflict of the whole play, namely the difficulty of weaving together the laws of man and the justice of the gods. So when we look at this extraordinarily famous and extraordinarily beautiful ode in context, it is not a celebration of humanism. Rather, if anything, it is a reminder of the limitations of humanism and of the sophist's viewpoint and of the failings of the sophist viewpoint. Along with the rest of the play, I think, this famous ode seems to indicate that human intellect alone, Denos though it may be, is not sufficient in and of itself. The gods' laws must indeed be taken into account, and Creon's suffering at the end of the play is the proof of that. So in this lecture, we have looked at Sophocles' famous play Antigone. In the next lecture, we will begin our examination of his greatest play of all, Oedipus the King.